Hi everybody, this is Dakota, and we're going to continue on with our exploration of depression. Now, so far, we've taken a look at the conventional standard model of depression, but you know what? We really need an entirely new model for depression. What's going on, how to treat it, and we're going to look at the herbs today that can do a very good job, as well as some other treatments. So, why do we need a new model for depression? First of all, the current models don't explain why some people are susceptible to depression but others are resilient. And current treatments were largely discovered by pure luck, unguided by any evidence of biological pathology. Plus, current models of depression are primarily based on drug response rather than vice versa, and nearly all of the recently introduced antidepressants are Me Too drugs. They differ only in the side effects, but not in how well they work. Plus, there aren't really any good biomarkers or tests to determine who's going to respond to which treatments. The reason why entirely new types of antidepressant drugs don't come out is because they're all based on the old model of depression, which says that it's all about being too low in serotonin, epinephrine, or dopamine. But research is uncovering a new model for depression which really is in keeping with what we've understood for a long time in natural medicine. So here are some of the causes: chronic inflammation, genetics, amino acid deficiencies like tyrosine and tryptophan, which are precursors to dopamine. Also, hypothyroidism, which we talked about before. Thyroid hormone controls metabolism of neurotransmitters in the brain. In the cells, it controls metabolism of sugars, fatty acids, and amino acids. And then there's a lack of exercise. Environmental toxins are huge, so is adrenal imbalance. And gut inflammation. We're understanding more and more all the time about the connection between the gut and the brain. What happens in the gut usually also happens in the brain, so if the gut's inflamed, the brain is also inflamed. So when we wade through the whole complexity, what we wind up with is a common pathway, the brain's runaway stress response. Now, that fight or flight response evolved to serve us. It required intense physical activity, and it was adaptive in the short term, but it's toxic in the long term. It disrupts the neural circuits in the brain that use chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholines, and this kind of disruption can lead directly to depressive illness. If it's left unchecked, it can actually damage the brain, especially in areas like the hippocampus, which is involved in memory. The bottom line is an inflamed brain is a depressed brain. For decades, American psychiatrists have taken diagnosis to be fundamental, and we've come up with all of these categories like depression, schizophrenia, PTSD, and they were all assumed to represent biologically distinct diseases. So the goal of the research was to figure out the biology, but that didn't work out. In 2013, the National Institute of Mental Health's director, Thomas Insel, announced that psychiatric science had failed to find unique biological mechanisms associated with specific diagnoses. What genetic underpinnings or neural circuits they had identified were mostly common across diagnostic groups, and diagnoses were neither particularly useful nor accurate for understanding the brain and would no longer be used to guide research. Then there was a program called Research Domain Criteria, and it said that all research must begin from a matrix of neuroscientific structures, in other words, the genes, the cells, the circuit, that cut across behavioral, cognitive, and social domains like acute fear, loss, arousal. And to use an example from the program's website, psychiatric researchers will no longer study people with anxiety. They'll study the fear circuitry. However, there are certain institutions, for example, the University of California, that are completely rejecting that system because it doesn't lead to useful research. They, like others, are starting fresh with a focus on how the brain and its trillions of synaptic connections work, and the implications are that social experience plays a huge role in who becomes mentally ill, when they fall ill, and how their illness unfolds. So we should view this illness to be caused not only by brain deficits, but by abuse, deprivation, inequality, which alter the way the brains behave. Illness requires social interventions, not just pharmacological ones. So the newer understanding of depression is that it's a sign of a whole body disease, because people who have depression tend also to have things like heart disease, stroke, obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome. The list goes on and on. The questions that are being asked include things like, is depression really an inflammatory disease? Is it oxidation? Is there damage to the DNA? Can treating depression also treat associated medical illnesses? One of the things that I've always wondered about is, how do you become deficient in serotonin or norepinephrine in the first place? Now, it's being suggested that one possible mechanism is that cortisol gets too high because you're stressed. That goes to the brain and turns down the manufacture of serotonin. So how can cortisol be destructive? First of all, one of them is genomic. In other words, it works with the genes. It can actually damage tissue, the hippocampus in particular. Hormones like cortisol can have very far-reaching effects because they have direct access to the nucleus of a cell, where they manipulate DNA in its expression of genes. Prolonged exposure to high levels of stress hormones can endanger your neurons. Can even kill your neurons. Another question that needs to be answered is, why are some people more vulnerable to cortisol and stress? Here's a clue. There's something called the serotonin transporter. It's in charge of recycling serotonin. It takes it out of the gap between the neurons and stuffs it back into the nerve. Most of the antidepressants that we use now, like Prozac, block the function of this transporter, so the nerve can't pull the serotonin back, and the consequence is the serotonin builds up to a higher concentration and it can deliver more signal. But genetically speaking, there are different kinds of transporter molecules. There are two varieties that are genetically coded. One's a little shorter than the other. And since every gene has two components, you can have either a short transporter gene, or a short-long, or a long transporter gene. And there was a study that was done in 2003 that showed that if you're not exposed to major stress at all, you still have about a 10% chance of developing major depression. But the more major stresses you're exposed to in your life, the more likely you're going to develop depression, regardless of the genetics. But if you break people down to how long these genotypes are of these serotonin transmitters, it turns out that people who have the long variety are much less sensitive to stress, triggering depression. These are the resilient people. If you have the short molecule, you've got a higher risk, depending on how many life stressors you have. If you have the short molecule, it means that you're going to have higher cortisol levels, whether you're stressed or not. And there's more to this story. It turns out that early childhood adversity can leave a permanent mark. With early life adversity, there's an epigenetic modification. The gene for cortisol receptors gets turned down, so there's no signal to turn off cortisol, and this can be permanent. It's a hyperactive stress system. The critical window seems to be between ages 12 and 19. Depression is a more advanced phase of the cortisol problem. The most important thing regarding this adverse childhood experience is how the family coped with adversity. Animal studies have shown that even when there's early life adversity, if there's a nurturing mother, the neurons are protected. Another way this new model of depression describes this illness is actually as an illness, an allergic inflammatory disease, And the basis for that is pretty obvious when it's pointed out that everybody feels miserable when they're ill. That feeling of being too tired, bored, too fed up to get off the couch and get on with life is known among psychologists as sickness behavior, and it happens for good reason. It helps us avoid doing more damage or spreading an infection, and it looks a lot like depression. So, if people with depression show classic sickness behavior, and sick people feel a lot like people with depression, maybe there's a common cause. And the answer seems to be yes. The best candidate so far is inflammation, a part of the immune system that acts as a burglar alarm to close wounds and call other parts of the immune system into action. A family of proteins called cytokines sets off inflammation in the body and switches the brain into sickness mode. Both cytokines and inflammation have been shown to rocket during depressive episodes, and in people with bipolar, they drop off in periods of remission. In some cases, infection can be the culprit. A diet rich in trans fats and sugar has been shown to promote inflammation, while a healthy one full of fruit, vegetables, healthy oils keeps inflammation at bay. Obesity is another risk factor, probably because body fat, particularly around the belly, stores large quantities of cytokines, and add to this the fact that stress, particularly the kind that follows a social rejection or loneliness, also causes inflammation. And it starts to look like depression is a kind of allergy to modern life, which might explain its spiraling prevalence all over the world as we increasingly eat, sloth, and isolate ourselves into a state of chronic inflammation. So what do we do about it? And what did our ancestors do to protect themselves? Before we get into the herbs, we'll take a look at 6 factors that play an important role. Exercise. Exercise is medicine. It changes the body and brain in ways that are more powerful than any pill you can take. 60% of adults get no regular activity. Exercise isn't natural. We're designed to be physically active in adaptive goals. When you look at a piece of exercise equipment, there's a part of the brain that screams out, "Don't do it. You're not going anywhere on that thing." Brisk walking with a friend, making it social. Well, brisk walking's been tested head-to-head against Zoloft twice, and in the long term at 1. At what dose? 30 minutes, 3 times a week. Omega-3 fatty acids are increased, and cutting down on the omega-6, which are pro-inflammatory. Sunlight, healthy sleep, social connection, and we're talking here FaceTime. And resist the urge to pull away. When we're ill, we want to withdraw. Diet is huge. We're not going to go into everything on diet here, but in the database we have an enormous section that covers all kinds of diets, nutrition, etc. And you can get in there and take a look at what kind of diet you think is going to work best for you. But the main thing is that it be a diet that counteracts inflammation. By the way, we've learned higher levels of serum high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, which is a marker of systemic inflammation, is an independent risk factor for a depressive episode. Among people suffering from depression, systemic immune activation characterized by increased levels of these pro-inflammatory cytokines and alterations in something called the acute phase protein response have been observed. Also, whole food diet provides protein and essential fatty acids, in addition to a range of micronutrients that are critical in neurochemical function. These include B vitamins, zinc, magnesium, vitamin C, and a range of plant compounds like the flavonoids that are potent anti-inflammatories and antioxidants. Okay, so it's time to turn to the herbs. Now, of course, we have a plethora of herbs that treat inflammation, as well as neuroprotective herbs. Ashwagandha is neuroprotective, it's anti-inflammatory, it improves insulin resistance, and in one trial it was found to be safe and effective as an adjunct to SSRIs in the treatment of OCD. It's able to regulate 15 immune system pathways. Because it's so neuroprotective, it's even been suggested for treating traumatic brain injury. A word of caution, it cannot be used with barbiturates. Maca The Menopause Journal in 2008 found it to be effective for anxiety and depression in postmenopausal women, and the BMC Complementary and Alternative Medicine Journal in 2006 found it beneficial for depression in all who took it, and it can also possibly improve memory, stamina, energy, all kinds of other things. The dose there is 1,500 to 3,000 milligrams per day. Chamomile is one of our top herbs for anxiety and stress in general. There was a study out of the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, 2009, that found that 57% of the participants in the chamomile group had reduced anxiety scores by more than 50% throughout the study. Not only did anxiety scores improve, but they continued to improve over the course of the study. And best of all, of course, chamomile comes without the nasty side effects of traditional anxiety and depression medications. With kava kava, a study using the water extract produced significant anti-anxiety and antidepressant activity, and at the dose that was used and for the duration it was studied, there were no safety concerns. It seemed to be equally effective in cases where anxiety is accompanied by depression. The study concluded that this extract, and possibly other kava extracts, was a good alternative to benzodiazepines, SSRIs, and other antidepressants in the treatment of non-psychotic anxiety disorders. It helps with anxiety, restlessness, insomnia, stress, neuralgia, headache, withdrawal from benzos, inflammation and infection, and even for acute pain due to spasms, so it's quite wide-ranging. I suggest that you subscribe to the database and look up this section. There are, as you see, several really good herbs here for depression. Read up on them, and then you'll be able to select which herbs you want to start with, learn how to use them, and definitely pay attention to the cautions. I'd like to turn your attention now to a wonderful contribution by David Winston. It's a differential located in this heading, Depression. Here he kind of breaks down the different ways that depression expresses itself and which herbs seem to help the most. Let's take a look at a few of these. So we see he's recommending asafoetida for depression with nervous irritation, hysteria, headache, dizziness, and flatulence. The muscles are tight, ticklish, or painful to the touch. Body armor. Black cohosh is for doom and gloom depression. That's a hormonal depression. You might see it postpartum or menstrual or menopausal. He suggests using it with cactus and tiger lily. Coffee bean. Nervous depression with dull thoughts and constipation. And let me just scroll through Damiana for mild depression with a marked loss of libido. Also the depression of the elderly, a stagnant depression. Use it with lavender and rosemary. It's also for depression associated with hypothyroidism. In that case, use it with ashwagandha and bacopa. Evening primrose, leaf, root bark, and flower. Depression associated with chronic dyspepsia, vomiting, a frequent desire to urinate. Here the patient is apathetic, gloomy, and despondent. One of the best herbs for gastrointestinal related depression, used with Culver's root and St. John's wort. Fresh milky oat seed. This is a good one for situational depression in the type A hyperactive people, emotionally brittle from chronic stress. Used with adaptogens. Ginkgo. Ginkgo, used for depression caused by vascular insufficiency due to old age or head trauma injuries. It's been shown to reduce antidepressant-induced anorgasmia in women and lack of libido. Used with Damiana and Asian ginseng. Holy basil, one of my favorites, an adaptogen used for stagnant depression. Now if you're wondering what all of these terms mean, like what is stagnant depression, the database will get you up to speed on that, so you can look all these up in the database. But here the patient is fixated on a specific traumatic event, complains of fatigue or mental fog. Used with lavender, St. John's wort, and rosemary. And then lavender flower. That's for a mild depression with difficulty thinking. The patient may remark he's in a fog, a stagnant depression. Again, you're starting to figure that out. That's where the patient is absolutely fixated on a specific traumatic event. Lemon balm is a mild mood elevator, good to use with St. John's wort, also for seasonal affective disorder. Mimosa's long been known as an antidepressive herb. It's a profound mood elevator for deficient insomnia, moodiness, broken hearts, griefs, and even PTSD, used with hawthorn and rose petals. Pulsatilla for depression with nervous, dizziness, restlessness. Here the patient's fearful, sad, constantly weeping, with frequent exclamations of sorrow or grief. Skip down here. Let's take a look at rosemary. That's for dull, lethargic depression. Thinking is too much of a bother. Constant mental fog. Also used for hepatic depression. Depression with cerebral insufficiency. So I'm gonna leave it to you to finish reading this. Just sign up for the database, and as you can see, we have not only the herbs but other types of therapies in here that are known to help with depression. Limbic system therapy, probiotics. Here's the best diet for depression. Nutritional psychiatry, which is pretty cool. Mindfulness practice, meditation and health. The essential oils for depression. We kind of went through that in a previous video. So there's a lot here to get you going. Thank you for watching. We'll be back with schizophrenia.